There's a particular sound a person makes when they laugh at you instead of with you, and I heard it on a Tuesday afternoon in March, standing in my own kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in my hand. I'd called to congratulate them. That's the part that still sits funny in my chest. I had no idea yet. I was calling to say, "Well done." It was my son's wife who answered, and when I said I'd heard the inn was finally open and how wonderful that was, she laughed. Light, easy, the way you'd laugh at a child who'd asked a charming but silly question. "Oh," she said, "that was almost 2 months ago. We kept the opening small, just close family and a few friends." And then she said my favorite part, the part I'll carry to my grave. "You know how these things are." I don't, actually. I've spent 40 years not knowing how these things are. I built a company from a single rented office above a hardware store in Belleville to a firm that did land development across half of eastern Ontario, and I did it knowing exactly how things are, which is to say, I read every line of every contract before anyone got a dollar of mine. So, no, I don't know how these things are, but I let her have the moment. I said something gentle, told her to give my son my love, and I set the phone down on the counter and I stood there listening to the furnace tick. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in this country, and I know some of you are out on the island where it's already dark by supper time, and some of you are in Alberta still squinting at afternoon sun, I'd like you to do something for me. Tell me what time it is where you sit. I want to know who's out there. I want to know who understands what it is to find out your own child planned a celebration of the thing you paid for and decided somewhere along the way that you weren't on the list. 2 months. A small opening. Just close family. I'm 67 years old. My name is Sylvia Renfrew, and I want to be clear about something before I go on because it matters to how the rest of this went. I am not a soft woman. I have been soft in the right rooms, with the right people, at the right times. Softness is a tool like any other, and I know when to use it. But I am not soft the way my son was hoping I'd be soft. He was hoping for the mother who hands over the money and then disappears politely until she's needed for a photograph. That woman doesn't exist, and the fact that he thought she did told me he'd never really been paying attention. I didn't call him back that night. I want you to understand that. Everything in me wanted to dial his number and hear him explain it, hear him apologize, hear him say his wife had misspoken. But I've learned that the things you do while your heart is loud are almost always the things you regret. So I didn't pick up the phone. I made myself a proper supper instead, sat at my own table, and I thought about paper. Let me back up, because this isn't really a story about a phone call. It's a story about a folder. My son came to me the previous spring with what he called an idea, though he showed up dressed like it was already a company. He had a leather portfolio and a haircut and a way of sitting forward in his chair that I recognized, because I used to do it myself in front of bankers when I was young and hungry. His wife came with him. She came dressed for somewhere else, somewhere after, the way she always does, like our visit was a thing to get through on the way to something better. She kissed my cheek and told me the house looked lovely. People tell you the house looks lovely when they want the air in the room to stay friendly. He'd found a property in Prince Edward County, a failing little inn on a county road, 12 rooms, a kitchen that needed gutting, a roof that needed replacing, and a view of the water that made you forgive all of it. He'd done his homework, I'll give him that. He talked about the wineries that had turned that whole peninsula into a destination, about Toronto money looking for weekend escapes, about the food scene, about occupancy rates and shoulder seasons, and the way a good restaurant attached to a good inn could carry both. He was good. He was genuinely good when he talked, and I sat there proud and wary in equal measure, which is the natural condition of a mother who is also a businesswoman. Then he got to the number. $600,000. He didn't say it like a question. He said it like a foregone conclusion, like the only thing left to discuss was the wire transfer. I didn't flinch. I've sat across from men trying to take a development site out from under me. A number doesn't move my face anymore. I asked him what the first draw would cover. I asked him about the kitchen build out and the liquor license and the timeline for the roof. Because in this country, you don't get a second chance at a roof before winter. And his wife leaned in, smooth as anything, and said, "We're trying to do this properly. We don't want a lot of outside people having a say." Outside people. I was sitting in the living room where my son took his first steps. But all right. My son nodded along with her. "I need this to be mine," he said. "Ours. I don't want it to feel like I just got handed mom's company in a new shape. And I want to be fair to him because there was something real in that. A man wants to build a thing he can put his own name on." I understood it. I built my own first company precisely so I'd never have to feel like I'd inherited my way into a room. So I didn't argue. What I said was, "All right, we'll do it your way." His shoulders came down a full inch. His wife smiled like she'd won a hand of cards, and I let them both believe exactly that, because I'd already decided how this was going to work, and it had nothing to do with anything we'd say out loud in my living room. Here is the thing I know that they didn't. I don't fund dreams. I never have. I underwrite them. There's a difference, and it lives entirely in the paperwork. We met again 10 days later in a boardroom my lawyer keeps downtown. Glass table, gray carpet, a watercolor of a lighthouse that nobody ever looks at until they're nervous. My son arrived early in a good suit. His wife arrived late with her phone in her hand, the way you arrive somewhere you already decided you own. My lawyer, Mr. Carmody, sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing, which is what I pay him to do, because silence in a room like that does more work than any speech. My son started talking the moment we sat down. The same confident music from my living room. He called it just making it official. I slid a folder across the table to him and I said, "This makes it clear, not official. There's a difference." I asked him a simple question. I asked who owned the inn. He said he did, he and his wife. I asked who owned it on the land registry, on paper, with a parcel number. He started talking about the offer they'd put in, about the financing, about how it was in progress. In progress is what people say when they want the money before they've built the thing that protects the money. So I told them how it would actually work, and I watched their faces the whole way through, because faces tell you what signatures won't. The 600,000 would not arrive as a lump. It would come in stages, enough to close on the property and start the roof, then more once the roof passed inspection and the renovation hit its first milestone, then the rest as the kitchen came online and the first bookings cleared. That's not me being controlling. That's me making sure the money builds an inn instead of vanishing into the kind of mistakes that hungry, hopeful people make. And the property itself, the land, the building, the thing the bank cares about, would be held by a holding company. My son and his wife would run the operation. They'd have a long-term lease, generous terms, every right to build and cook and host and grow. But the bones of the place, the dirt and the deed, would sit inside a structure that I controlled until certain conditions were met, until the milestones were hit, until the reports were delivered, until the loan was current. Once all of that was satisfied, the lease would convert, the ownership would transfer to them outright, and I'd step back for good. His wife's smile thinned. "So you'd own it," she said, in a voice meant to make me sound like a tyrant. "I'd hold it," I said, "until you've shown me you can carry it. Then it's yours, free and clear, in writing, no takebacks. That's not a leash. That's a bridge." My son's jaw worked. He found the clause that said the arrangement would unwind once the conditions were met, and I watched his shoulders relax the way they had in my living room. He turned to his wife. "See," he said, "it's temporary." Temporary. Temporary. He said it like it was a small thing that would sit in a drawer and never get up and walk around. He thought because I was his mother, I'd never actually treat this like business when feelings got involved. Mr. Carmody slid the last pages across. I told them to read every line. My son smiled and said, "We trust you, Mom," and reached for the pen. I didn't smile back. Trust is not a substitute for reading. But he signed, and his wife signed with a flourish, and the pen marks settled onto the page like quiet little promises, and we all shook hands, and his wife hugged me carefully, the way you'd hug someone you've already started to think of as standing outside your house, looking in. For a while it was good. I'll give them that summer. The roof went on before the leaves turned, which mattered more than they understood. The kitchen got gutted and rebuilt. My son sent me photos in those first weeks. The dumpster, the new beams, a wall coming down to open up the dining room. He'd call and talk too fast about the tile he'd found and the chef he was courting from a place in Toronto. He was alive in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy, and there were nights I'd hang up the phone and feel, underneath the wariness, something close to joy. Then autumn came, and the calls got shorter. It started so small I told myself I was imagining it. "We're swamped, Mom. I'll call you tonight." He didn't. "We're interviewing front desk staff. Can I get back to you?" He didn't. His wife started answering more often than he did. Never every time, just enough to feel like an accident instead of a pattern. "He's in a meeting. He's exhausted. He's so focused right now." She said the word focused like it was a closed door, and behind the door was a room I used to be allowed in, and I noticed the other thing, the thing that actually told me where I stood. They'd started posting little pieces of the renovation, the inn taking shape, captions about building something from nothing, about late nights and big dreams and a husband and wife team chasing a vision. I'd scroll past photos of the two of them in hard hats, laughing in front of the new sign, and I'd read the comments from their friends. "So inspiring, self-made, look what you two built." And I never once saw my name, not a tag, not a mention, not a quiet little, "We couldn't have done this without family." I was the $600,000 that held up every joist in those photographs, and I had been edited out of the story so cleanly you'd never know I'd been there at all. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I didn't need a plaque. I didn't need to be in the photos. I have spent enough of my life in the actual rooms where the actual decisions get made that I stopped needing the photographs a long time ago. That wasn't the wound. The wound was watching my son let it happen, because a man who lets his wife write his mother out of the story isn't confused. He's choosing. He's choosing the comfort of being thought self-made over the discomfort of telling the truth, and he'd decided I was a price worth paying for that comfort. In November, I got a call from an old colleague of mine, Walter, who'd put a little money into the inn at my invitation. I'd brought in two trusted people precisely so my son couldn't confuse my support for something he could ignore. Walter and I went back 30 years. He started the call easy, talking shop, the way men our age do before they say the thing they actually called about. Then his voice changed. "I saw the soft launch they did," he said. "Looks sharp. Beautiful job on the dining room." A pause. "I didn't see you there, Sylvia. Was that on purpose?" My stomach went still. Not surprised. Confirmed. The editing hadn't stayed inside my family. It had reached the people who'd written checks on my word. So I knew before the Tuesday in March. I knew before the phone call where she laughed and said 2 months and just close family, and you know how these things are. By the time she said it, I'd already opened the folder. I'd already sat at my dining table with a legal pad and written one line across the top and underlined it twice, what was promised and what was signed. Because here is what they'd forgotten. In their captions and their photographs and their husband and wife vision, they were running that inn on a lease. They didn't own the ground it sat on. The deed lived inside a holding company, and that company answered to me, and the loan that built the place came with conditions written in plain English on pages they've been too busy trusting me to read. The first thing I did was nothing. That's the part people get wrong about how this works. They imagine I stormed up to the county and made a scene. I didn't. I requested the financials. That's all. A polite email, copied to Mr. Carmody, noting that under the terms of our agreement I was owed quarterly reporting that hadn't arrived, and that I'd appreciate the books, the bookings, the vendor accounts, and the loan ledger within 14 days. Standard. Boring. The kind of email that sits in your inbox looking like nothing until you understand what it actually is. My son called me within the hour. The fast voice was gone. Mom, what is this? Why are you sending lawyer emails? It's the reporting you agreed to, I said. It's in the loan agreement. Sanction 4. We've been busy, we just opened. 8 weeks ago, I said. Apparently. He went quiet. And then he said the thing that told me he still didn't understand the room he was standing in. Look, I'm sorry about the opening. We should have invited you. It was a small thing, but you don't need to get the lawyer involved. He searched for the word, that's aggressive. Aggressive. There it was. The word people reach for when you ask them to be accountable to something they signed. I'm not being aggressive, I told him. I'm being accurate. Send the books. The books, when they came, told me a story I'd seen coming from the captions alone. They'd spent like people who thought the money was theirs instead of borrowed. The renovation had run over. Fine, renovation too. But they'd hired a head of revenue. They'd taken draws against milestones that, when Mr. Carmody and I went through them line by line, hadn't actually been met. The kitchen wasn't fully certified. 2 of the inspections they'd signed off as complete were, in fact, conditional. And the property tax. The county doesn't care about your vision. The property tax was sitting unpaid, accruing, on land that wasn't even theirs. And then, a few days later, the phone call that I think is the one you've all been waiting for, because it's the one that tells you everything about who these people were when the lights were on and the cameras were off. It was the wife. No laugh this time. Sylvia, she said, and her voice had a tightness in it she couldn't quite smooth over. The property tax bill is overdue, and the gas account. The accounts are saying the next draw is on hold. Did you not send the money? Did I not send the money? I want you to sit with that, the way I sat with it, the phone warm against my ear, the snow coming down outside my window, in that heavy, silent Ontario way. 2 months earlier I hadn't been worth an invitation. I wasn't close family. I was someone you laughed about. And now there was a bill, and the money was late. And somewhere in her mind, the natural order of things had reasserted itself. When there's a bill, you call Sylvia, and Sylvia pays. I didn't raise my voice. I never do. The day I learned to keep my voice level while my heart did something else entirely was the day I stopped losing negotiations. The next draw is on hold, I said, because the milestones tied to it haven't been met. The kitchen certification is incomplete. 2 inspections are conditional. And the reporting I requested arrived 11 days late. I let that sit. The property tax is your operating responsibility under the lease. So is the gas. I didn't send the money because, under the agreement everyone in that boardroom signed, it isn't owed yet. There was a silence on the line, and in it I could hear her recalculating, could hear, almost. The sound of a room she thought she controlled, turning out to have rules she couldn't charm her way around. So you're just gonna let it go under, she said finally. Over a technicality, your own son's business. I'm not letting anything go under, I said. I'm asking it to stand on the legs everyone promised it could stand on. That's different. And it isn't a technicality. The technicality is the only reason there's anything to fight about. If I'd just handed him $600,000 because I love him, that money would be gone and so would the inn. The structure is the thing keeping the inn alive while the 2 of you figure out how to run it. You're welcome, by the way. She hung up. People do when you stop being the version of yourself they need you to be. My son came to see me 3 days after that, in person. He drove 2.5 hours through bad weather and showed up at my door with no portfolio and no haircut and none of the founder's posture he'd worn into the boardroom. Just my boy, stamping snow off his boots, looking 10 years older than he had in the summer. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table I'd sat at writing what was promised, what was signed, and for a while neither of us said much. I made tea. We're a family that makes tea when we don't know what to say, and there's a kindness in that I've never properly thanked my own mother for. I didn't fight her on the opening, he said finally, not looking at me. About inviting you. She said it would look like we couldn't have done it without you, and he stopped. I let it stand. I knew it was wrong and I let it stand because some part of me wanted it to be true, that I'd done it myself. I didn't rush to comfort him. That's a hard thing for a mother. Every instinct I have is to make my child stop hurting. But I've learned that the kindest thing you can do for someone who's finally telling the truth is to let them finish telling it. You didn't do it yourself, I said when he was done. You don't have to apologize for that. Nobody does it themselves. Anyone who tells you they did is lying, or they're about to fail, or both. I had people who held the ladder while I climbed, and I spent years being ashamed of that, and the shame nearly cost me more than the climb did. I poured. The trouble was never that you needed me. The trouble was that you wanted my money and my distance at the same time, and those two things together always cost something. He turned his cup around on the table. The bank's nervous now, he said. The draw being on hold. The taxes. Walter called and asked me directly whether you were still backing the project. He looked up. What do I do? And this is the part I want the rest of you to hear, because I think a lot of you have a child like mine, or a sibling, or someone you've bankrolled who treats you like a wall socket. There, reliable, ignorable. You ask me what I did, I'll tell you what I didn't do. I didn't pull the money to teach him a lesson. I didn't let the inn fail to prove a point. Punishing him would have felt wonderful for about a week, and then it would have rotted in me for years, and it would have taken his future down with my satisfaction. And that's not justice. That's just a more expensive kind of tantrum. What I did was make the structure real to him. I told him the draw would resume the moment the milestones were genuinely met, not signed off as met, actually met. I told him I was bringing in someone to manage the books, a sharp young accountant named Nadia who I'd worked with before, and that she'd stay on not as a punishment but as a backbone, because a business that survives by the owner's energy alone dies the first time the owner gets tired. And I told him the lease and the ownership would still convert to him and his wife exactly as written, once the conditions were honored. Nothing had changed. The bridge was still there. He'd just have to actually walk across it. And the captions, I said, because I'm not a saint, and there was one thing I wanted said out loud. The story you let her tell. He nodded slowly. I'll fix it. I didn't tell him how. I found people resent being told how to do the right thing almost as much as they resent doing the wrong one. I just let him sit with it. What he did quietly, which is how I knew it was real. There was no grand apology post, no teary confession to his followers, none of the theater that the wife would probably have preferred because at least theater can be controlled. Instead, the next time the inn put out anything public, a piece in a regional paper about the county's new spots, an interview where a reporter asked the standard "How did you do it?" question, my son said plainly that the inn existed because of patient family capital and a financial structure he hadn't understood when he started and was grateful for now. He named me, not gushing. Just true. He said his mother had built her career in development and had insisted on the kind of discipline that he'd resented at the time, and that had, he now saw, saved the place. I read it standing in my kitchen, and I won't pretend my eyes stayed dry. Through the winter, the inn steadied. Not dramatically. Real recovery is never dramatic. The taxes got paid on time because they had to be. The kitchen got properly certified. Nadia tightened the books until spending stopped being a reflex and became a decision. By the time the county came back to life in the spring, the bookings were strong and the loan was current and the milestones, the genuine ones, started falling like dominoes that had finally been stood up straight. The wife and I never had a reconciliation scene. I want to be honest about that because the stories people tell about these things always end with a tearful hug, and life mostly doesn't. She didn't apologize. She didn't argue either. She simply got quieter, the way people do when they finally understand that the room has rules they can't flirt or laugh their way past. She wasn't destroyed. I never wanted her destroyed. She was just repositioned. Her influence stopped reaching into places it had never belonged. When the lease converted and the ownership transferred to the two of them, free and clear, exactly as the pages had promised, she signed her name with none of the flourish she'd had the first time. I think by then she understood what the flourish had cost her. My son and I are different now. He calls without needing something, which is, if you've never had a child who only calls when they need something, a thing more valuable than the $600,000 ever was. There was an evening last fall, a year, almost to the week, after the inn opened the first time without me, when they did it again. A proper anniversary dinner at the inn, the dining room full, the water dark and shining out the windows, and this time my name was on the invitation, and my son stood up at the front of the room, in front of his guests and his investors and his wife, and he raised a glass. He didn't make a speech about betrayal or forgiveness. We don't do that in this family. We make tea, and we say the true thing once and let it land. He said the inn was standing because his mother had refused to fund a dream and had insisted on building a structure instead, and that he'd spent a year learning the difference, and that he was finished pretending it had ever been otherwise. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. People just nodded, the way people nod when something finally settles into the right shape. And I sat there, not at the head of the table and not hidden at the back, just present, where I belonged the whole time, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been clenched since a Tuesday in March. She thought leaving me off the list made her the one with the power. She never understood that I was the foundation the whole place was built on, and you can leave a foundation out of the photographs all you like. The house still doesn't stand without it. Nothing in this story turned on luck. Every part of it grew out of something planted earlier, the way a roof you put on before the snow either holds or it doesn't, depending on the choices you made in the dry months. When my son's wife laughed at me on the phone, that laugh didn't come from nowhere. It came from months of small edits, of being let in less and less, of a story being told in captions where my name kept getting trimmed off the end. And when the taxes came due and there was no money, that didn't come from nowhere either. It came from spending like the money was theirs instead of borrowed. Causes have their children, and those children grow up and knock on your door whether you invited them or not. What kept the inn standing wasn't my anger. Anger is cheap, and it spends fast. What kept it standing was that I'd done the unglamorous thing a year earlier, read every line, held the deed, tied the money to milestones instead of feelings. People think being clever means being clever in the moment, having the sharp reply ready. It doesn't. The real cleverness happens long before the moment arrives. In the boring folder nobody wants to open. In the page my son trusted me too much to read. I wasn't smarter than them in that phone call. I was smarter than them the previous spring, and the phone call just collected on it. But being right on paper would have been a cold thing on its own, and I want to be honest about the other piece. I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be once I held all the cards. I could have let the inn go under to teach my son a lesson he'd have remembered with bitterness for the rest of his life. I didn't, and not because I'm soft. Because the point was never to win. The point was to leave him standing, and to leave myself someone I could live with at 3 in the morning. There's a difference between justice and revenge, And the difference is whether you can still look at the person afterward. And none of it would have mattered if I hadn't been willing to sit in the hurt without flinching. Anyone can keep going when it's easy. The thing that's hard, the thing I'd ask you to build in yourself, is the steadiness to wait, to not pick up the phone while your heart is loud, to let the silence do its slow work while everyone around you mistakes your patience for weakness. Brenna mistook it. Aiden very nearly did. They both thought my calm was consent. It wasn't. It was a foundation. And you can leave a foundation off the invitation, out of the photographs, out of the story you tell your friends. The house still doesn't stand a single winter without it.